A blizzard engulfs the Alaskan wilderness, and a war survivor believes he might vanish in. 33 years old, a Navy sailor, broad shoulders, disciplined silence, a past buried beneath the snow, guilt and a mistake he will never forgive himself for. He lost his canine companion years ago, and the war never truly ended. Then a storm changed it all. A young woman is swept into the frozen forest. Gunfire disappears into the swirling white mist, and from the storm, a scarred German shepherd emerges, silent, alert, moving with military precision, a hand signal, a seemingly impossible response. The dog he buried in his memory has returned through the storm. This is more than just a rescue. This is a story of loyalty stronger than death, and a warrior finding his purpose where the war finally ends. If stories like this move you, subscribe now, because some miracles don't happen naturally. They always accompany us through the storms. Snow swept across the frozen Alaskan plain under a sky the color of steel, swallowing sound, light and memory alike. Ethan Cole arrived in the town of Coldridge just before dusk, when the day surrendered without resistance to the long northern night. The settlement was little more than a scattering of wooden buildings pressed against the edge of the wilderness. Their roofs bowed beneath years of snow and wind. Mountains rose in the distance like silent sentinels, jagged and merciless, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. It was the kind of place the world forgot easily, and that was precisely why Ethan had chosen it. He parked his weather-beaten pickup beside a modest cabin at the edge of town and sat motionless for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Silence wrapped around him, thick and heavy, and with it came the familiar pressure in his chest, the quiet echo of things he had never truly left behind. Ethan Cole was 33 years old, though the hard lines etched into his face made him appear older. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his physique shaped not by vanity, but by years of relentless military training. His arms were thick with corded muscle, his hands scarred and calloused, knuckles bearing faint white lines from old fractures that had healed crookedly. His skin was weathered, tanned unevenly by desert suns and Arctic winds alike, marked by small scars that told fragments of stories he never shared. His hair, once a deep brown, was cropped close to regulation length, streaked now with premature gray at the temples. A trimmed beard shadowed a strong jawline, angular and severe, giving his face a permanently guarded expression. His eyes were a striking gray blue, sharp and observant, but dulled by exhaustion, like a blade that had been sharpened too many times without rest. Ethan was a sailor of the United States Navy, a combat operator who had spent the better part of his adult life moving from one hostile environment to another. Discipline was etched into every movement he made. He walked with purpose, even when there was nowhere to go, and stood with a straight-backed posture that spoke of long hours under watchful command. He spoke little, listened carefully, and assessed every space he entered as if it might turn deadly without warning. To strangers, he appeared distant, cold even, but beneath that restraint lay a man whose loyalty ran deep and whose sense of responsibility bordered on self-destruction. The event that had fractured him did not come from enemy fire or battlefield defeat, but from a single moment in the mountains of northern Afghanistan, years earlier, when nature itself had become the executioner. Rex had been 3 years old then, a fully operational K9 trained for high-risk tracking and assault missions. He was a German shepherd, large even by military standards, with a powerful chest, thick sable-colored fur, and amber eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. Rex moved with absolute confidence, every step measured, every motion controlled. His ears stood alert, his tail rarely wagged, his demeanor calm and professional. He had been trained to ignore chaos, pain, and fear, responding only to commands and threats. To Ethan, Rex was not equipment or backup. He was a partner. They had trained together, bled together, trusted each other with their lives. Rex had known Ethan's hand signals better than spoken words, had sensed danger before human eyes could detect it. And then, during a winter pursuit through unstable mountain terrain, the earth had given way. A thunderous crack, a wall of white, and Rex had vanished beneath the avalanche while Ethan was thrown clear. Rescue teams searched until hope became protocol, and protocol became paperwork. Rex was declared lost in action. Ethan was told it wasn't his fault. He never believed them. That guilt followed Ethan across continents and oceans, settling deep into his bones. It was the reason he requested reassignment away from active deployment, the reason he turned down promotions, the reason he now stood in the frozen quiet of Coldridge, Alaska, trying to outrun a memory that refused to be buried. He carried an old injury in his left shoulder from that same mission, a reminder that flared painfully in the cold, but it was nothing compared to the wound that never healed. The silence here was supposed to help. Instead, it gave his thoughts too much room to breathe. The cabin he had rented was small but functional, built of thick logs darkened by age. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and cold iron. Ethan moved through the space with automatic efficiency, unpacking only the essentials. His gear was meticulously organized, every item placed with care. Military habits died hard, especially when they were the only thing keeping the past at bay. He lit the stove, boiled water, and sat on a narrow chair near the window, watching snow gather against the glass. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. It reminded him of the nights overseas when storms masked the sound of approaching danger, when instincts mattered more than orders. His jaw tightened as he clenched his fists, forcing himself back into the present. Over the next few days, Ethan settled into a routine designed to keep his mind occupied. He ran long distances through the snow-covered trails beyond town, pushing his body until his lungs burned and his legs trembled. He chopped firewood until sweat froze against his skin. He repaired old fencing for locals who asked few questions and paid in quiet gratitude. The townspeople noticed him. Of course, in a place as small as Coldridge, a stranger never went unseen. They saw a man who was polite but reserved, respectful yet distant, a man who helped without asking and spoke only when necessary. They did not know what he carried inside, and Ethan was determined to keep it that way. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Ethan returned from a supply run and noticed something unusual near the tree line behind his cabin. The snow there was disturbed, marked by faint tracks partially filled by fresh snowfall. He crouched low, examining them with trained precision. They were canine, large, and oddly deliberate in spacing. His breath caught despite himself. Wolves were common this far north. But these tracks were different, too controlled, too purposeful. A familiar unease settled over him, equal parts dread and impossible hope. He shook his head sharply, dismissing the thought as fatigue, as wishful thinking born of loneliness. Rex was gone. He had accepted that, or at least, he told himself he had. That night, sleep came in fragments. Ethan dreamed of snow collapsing underfoot, of amber eyes disappearing into white darkness. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the echo of a distant bark ringing in his ears. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he pressed his palms to his face and exhaled slowly, forcing calm through discipline alone. Whatever he had come to Alaska to find, he realized now that the wilderness had no intention of offering peace freely. It would demand confrontation, just as every battlefield had before it. Outside, the wind carried something else on it, something he could not name yet. Something that stirred instincts he thought long buried. By the time the sun crept weakly over the horizon, casting pale light across the frozen world, Ethan Cole stood at the threshold of his cabin, staring into the endless white. He had come here to disappear, to survive quietly on the edges of memory. Instead, the mountains watched him with ancient patience, as if they knew his story was not finished. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen and unheard, the past stirred, and with it, the possibility that the bond he believed broken forever might still be alive, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally force him to face it. The forest beyond Coldridge lay buried beneath layers of snow and silence, broken only by the slow creak of trees bending under winter's weight. Ethan Cole first noticed the boy by accident. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking low behind the mountains, when Ethan was returning from one of his long, solitary runs through the outer trails. His breath steamed in the frozen air, his boots crunching steadily over packed snow. The forest here was denser than the open plains near town, thick with spruce and fir, their branches heavy and dark. Ethan slowed when he saw movement ahead, small, careful, deliberate, a child, no more than 8 years old, bundled in an oversized coat that nearly swallowed his thin frame, was trudging through the snow with determined steps. The boy was slight and narrow-shouldered, short for his age, with pale skin that stood out starkly against the red wool scarf wrapped several times around his neck. His hair was a light sandy blonde, cut unevenly as if by untrained hands, and his cheeks were flushed raw from the cold. What caught Ethan's attention was not just the child's presence so far from town, but the way he moved, quiet, cautious, stopping often to listen, as if he knew the forest watched him back. Ethan slowed his pace, instinctively keeping distance. Years of training had taught him that sudden appearances could frighten civilians, especially children. The boy reached the edge of a small clearing and knelt beside a fallen log. From inside his coat, he pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it carefully on a flat stone. Ethan watched from behind a tree, every sense alert. The child didn't call out or whistle. He simply waited for several long seconds. Well, nothing happened. Then the forest shifted. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadows beyond the trees, moving low and fluid, almost invisible against the snow. It was a dog. The animal was large, unmistakably a German shepherd, its body lean and powerful despite visible signs of hardship. Its coat was thick and mottled with dark sable and gray, dulled by dirt and old bloodstains that no longer bled. Scars crossed its flank and shoulders, pale lines against darker fur, the kind that did not come from random fights but from violence survived. One ear bore a slight notch near the tip, and its right hind leg moved with the faintest hitch. Barely noticeable unless one knew how to look, the dog approached the food cautiously, head low, amber eyes scanning the surroundings with sharp, calculating focus before flicking briefly toward the boy. There was no wagging tail, no eager rush. This was not a stray begging for scraps. This was a creature that assessed risk before reward. Ethan's chest tightened. He had seen that posture before. He had lived beside it. The boy stepped back, giving the dog space, his small hands clenched nervously at his sides. "It's okay," the child whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "My mom made extra." The dog hesitated, then moved forward, eating quickly but neatly, its movements disciplined, controlled. When it finished, it sat, not sprawled, not relaxed, but upright, alert, eyes still sweeping the tree line. The boy smiled, a small, secretive smile full of relief, then gathered his courage and reached out slowly. His fingers brushed the dog's thick fur once. Lightly, the dog did not flinch, but it did not lean in either. It accepted the touch as it might accept a necessary fact of the world. Ethan felt a sharp, almost painful pull in his chest. His mind rejected the thought, even as his instincts screamed it. This dog's behavior was not coincidence. It was training, years of it. The spacing of its steps, the way it positioned itself with its back to cover, the constant scanning, all hallmarks of a working K9, and the limp, the scar patterns. His breath caught as memory surged forward unbidden. Rex had limped after Yemen. Rex had learned to sit exactly like that during perimeter holds. Ethan forced himself to stay still, to breathe, to observe. Jumping to conclusions was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. The dog finished its silent vigil and, without warning, rose and melted back into the forest, disappearing so completely it was as if it had never been there. The boy waited a moment longer, then wrapped the cloth and tucked it back under his coat. He turned to leave and froze when he saw Ethan standing several yards away. The child's eyes widened, fear flashing across his face. Ethan immediately raised both hands, palms open, lowering himself slightly to appear less threatening. "Easy," Ethan said, his voice calm and steady, the tone he used with civilians and nervous locals. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy hesitated, then nodded, though his body remained tense. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Ethan added gently. "It's dangerous this far into the woods." The boy swallowed. "I know the way," he said quietly. His voice was soft but stubborn, like someone forced to grow up too quickly. "I come here every day." "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Caleb," the boy replied after a pause. "My mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers." "That's good advice," Ethan said, allowing a faint, reassuring smile. "I'm Ethan, but I live near the edge of town." He glanced toward the trees where the dog had vanished. "Is that your dog?" Caleb shook his head quickly. "No, he needs help." Ethan studied the boy's face, noting the seriousness in his eyes, the lack of childish exaggeration. "Where's your mother?" "She's at home," Caleb said. "She doesn't know I come this far." There was guilt there, and fear, but also determination. Ethan recognized it instantly. He had worn that same expression once, long ago. When duty overruled caution, Ethan walked Caleb back toward the edge of the forest, maintaining a respectful distance as they neared a modest cabin set deeper among the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. A woman stepped out onto the porch, her posture immediately alert. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, her build lean rather than fragile, shaped by hard work and isolation. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a loose braid streaked with frost, strands escaping to frame a pale, angular face. Her skin was fair, weathered by cold and wind, and her eyes, deep green and sharp, studied Ethan with guarded intensity. "Caleb," she called, her voice firm but edged with relief. "I told you not to wander so far." "I'm sorry, Mom," Caleb said. Lowering his head, the woman descended the steps, positioning herself subtly between Ethan and her son. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone was polite, but her stance betrayed readiness, the kind that came from living without backup. "I'm Ethan Cole," he said. "I saw your son in the woods and wanted to make sure he got home safe." She nodded slowly. "Mara Whitaker," she replied. "Thank you." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the trees. "Did he see anything?" Ethan hesitated, then chose honesty. "I saw the dog." Mara exhaled sharply, a mix of frustration and worry crossing her face. "I told him not to feed it," she said quietly. "But he doesn't listen." "He's trying to help," Ethan said. "That dog isn't dangerous." Mara's jaw tightened. "You don't know that." "I know trained dogs," Ethan replied evenly. "That one was trained." Silence stretched between them. Mara's eyes searched his face, reading the truth in his calm certainty. "If you're right," she said slowly, "then it's more dangerous than you think." That night, back in his cabin, Ethan couldn't sleep. Images of the dog replayed in his mind, every movement etched with painful familiarity. The rationale part of him insisted it was impossible. Rex had been buried under tons of ice and snow. But another part, the part shaped by years of trust and survival, whispered that some bonds did not break easily. As the wind rose again outside, Ethan sat awake in the dark, staring toward the forest, knowing with a certainty that unsettled him deeply that his past had not stayed buried in the mountains where he lost it. It had followed him here, into the white, and it was only beginning to reveal itself. The storm arrived without warning, swallowing the world in white fury and silence within a single breath. By the time Ethan Cole sensed the shift in the air, the sky above Coldridge had already darkened to a bruised, oppressive gray. Snow no longer drifted lazily from the clouds. It was driven sideways by a rising wind that screamed through the forest like a living thing. Visibility collapsed to a handful of feet, and the temperature dropped with vicious speed. Ethan stood outside his cabin, muscles tensing beneath his heavy coat, every instinct forged by years of combat telling him this was no ordinary storm. This was the kind of weather that erased tracks, muffled screams, and buried mistakes beneath layers of ice. He thought of Caleb. The image of the boy moving alone through the woods replayed in Ethan's mind with unsettling clarity. Caleb Whitaker was small for his age, thin-limbed but stubborn, his quiet determination shaped by a life spent on the edge of civilization. The boy had learned to be careful, to listen more than he spoke, and to survive without complaint. Ethan had recognized those traits immediately. They were the traits of people who adapted because they had no choice. And now, as the storm intensified, those same traits might not be enough. Ethan pulled on his tactical gloves, his movements precise and efficient, and headed into the blizzard. Each step forward was an act of resistance against the wind, snow stinging his face like shards of glass. He navigated by memory and instinct, following the barely visible trail that led toward the Whitaker cabin. The forest groaned and cracked around him, branches snapping under the weight of accumulating ice. Somewhere in the distance, a tree fell with a thunderous crash, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. Mara Whitaker sensed the danger long before she saw it. She had lived in isolation long enough to recognize when the mountain turned hostile. Inside the cabin, she moved quickly, her tall, lean frame tense but controlled. Mara stood just under 5'10", her posture straight, her movements economical, shaped by years of physical labor and self-reliance. Her dark hair, usually braided tightly, had come loose and framed her angular face, pale skin flushed with cold and worry. Her green eyes, Sioux, sharp and perceptive, flicked constantly between the shuttered windows and the door. Caleb sat at the small wooden table, his shoulders hunched inside his coat, clutching a chipped mug of tea with trembling hands. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howl outside. "He won't make it in this." Mara crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders gently but firmly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and steady. We stay inside. We don't open the door for anyone unless we're sure the storm will pass. Even as she spoke, unease coiled tight in her chest. This storm felt wrong, too sudden, too violent. The first sound came as a dull impact against the side of the cabin, heavy and deliberate, not the random strike of wind or falling debris. Mara's body stiffened instantly. Her hand moved to the hunting knife she kept sheathed at her belt, fingers wrapping around the worn handle. Years ago, she might have frozen in fear. That woman had died alongside her husband in a different storm. A different winter. The Mara who stood now was hardened by loss and responsibility. Another impact followed, closer this time, accompanied by voices, male. Unfamiliar, raised just enough to carry over the wind. Caleb's eyes widened. Mom, Mara motioned him back, positioning herself between her son and the door. Stay quiet, she whispered. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to listen. These were not lost hikers. There was purpose in the way they moved, in the way they tested the cabin's perimeter. Outside, 3 men advanced through the storm with grim determination. The first was Grant Holloway, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a thick neck and a heavy beard matted with snow. His face was coarse, scarred, and permanently twisted into an expression of impatience. Grant was muscle, accustomed to forcing problems into submission, his temper short and his methods brutal. Behind him moved Elias Korn, leaner and more calculating, his narrow face clean-shaven. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His dark hair was slicked back beneath a hood, and his eyes were cold, restless, always searching. Elias was the planner, the one who spoke softly and thought 3 steps ahead. The third man, younger and visibly uneasy, was Jonah Pike, the thin, hollow-eyed, with trembling hands and a nervous habit of glancing over his shoulder. He carried a rifle awkwardly, like a burden he was not meant to bear. They said no one lived this far out. Jonah muttered, his voice shaking. Storm changes things. Elias replied calmly, Storm gives us cover. We take what we need and move on. The door burst inward with a crack of splintering wood. Snow and wind surged into the cabin as Grant kicked it open, his massive frame filling the doorway. Mara reacted instantly, shoving Caleb behind her. Knife raised. Get out, she shouted, her voice fierce despite the fear clawing at her chest. Grant laughed, a low, ugly sound. Easy. Lady, we just need a place to wait this out. Elias stepped in behind him, his gaze sweeping the cabin, cataloging every detail, every exit, every weakness. His eyes lingered on Caleb. Looks like we found insurance, he said quietly. Before Mara could react, Jonah moved forward, grabbing her arm. The knife fell uselessly to the floor. Caleb cried out as Grant seized him, hauling the struggling boy close. Mara's scream was swallowed by the storm as Elias slammed the door shut, plunging the cabin into dim, flickering lamplight. Ethan reached the edge of the clearing just as the lights inside the Whitaker cabin went out. His blood ran cold. Tracks in the snow told the story quickly and brutally. Multiple sets of boots, heavy, deliberate, converging on the cabin. He circled wide, his body moving automatically into a tactical assessment. He was one man, alone, against multiple hostiles in a blizzard, but retreat was not an option. A low movement caught his eye at the far edge of the clearing. A shape emerged from the storm, silent and controlled. The German shepherd stood half hidden among the trees, snow clinging to its thick fur. Its amber eyes locked onto the cabin, unblinking, up close. There was no denying it now. The scars, the limp, the posture. It was Rex, older, leaner, hardened by survival. But unmistakably Rex. Ethan's breath hitched painfully. He did not speak. He did not move. Slowly, deliberately. He raised his left hand and made a subtle gesture, 2 fingers closing against his palm. The dog's ears flicked forward. Its body shifted instantly, muscles coiling with recognition and purpose. Years of separation collapsed into a single moment of absolute understanding. The storm howled around them. But for Ethan, everything narrowed to clarity. The guilt, the grief, the doubt, all of it burned away, replaced by cold focus. Rex had survived. And now, once again, they stood on the same side of a fight. Inside the cabin, Mara struggled against her restraints, fury blazing in her eyes as she watched Elias bind her wrists. Caleb sobbed quietly, pressed against Grant's chest, his face pale with terror. You said you wouldn't hurt him. Mara spat. Elias met her gaze without emotion. then cooperate. And I won't need to. He's outside. Ethan crouched low beside Rex, snow swirling around them like smoke. He leaned close, his voice barely a breath. Watch, he whispered. Wait for my signal. Rex did not bark. He did not whine. He simply moved, disappearing into the storm, circling the cabin with lethal patience. Ethan followed, every step measured, every decision sharpened by the knowledge that a child's life hung in the balance. He was no longer running from the past. He was standing in it, armed with the skills, discipline, and loyalty that had once defined him. As the blizzard raged on, burying the world in white, the hunters inside the cabin believed themselves hidden, protected by nature's fury. They did not yet understand that the storm had brought with it something far more dangerous than cold and darkness. It had brought back a soldier and his dog, and together, they were done losing what they loved. The blizzard did not relent. It intensified, tightening its grip on the forest as if the mountain itself were testing who belonged and who did not. Ethan Cole moved through the storm with measured precision, every step deliberate, his breath controlled despite the burning cold in his lungs. Years of combat had taught him how to move when fear threatened to take over, and now those instincts guided him as surely as any map. Behind him, Mara Whitaker followed, her tall, lean frame hunched against the wind, boots biting into the snow with grim determination. She was not trained for this kind of pursuit, but desperation had sharpened her senses. Her face was pale beneath wind-burned skin, dark hair whipped loose from its braid, eyes fixed forward with the fierce focus of a mother who refused to lose her child. Rex moved ahead of them, a silent phantom threading through the trees. The German shepherd was no longer the cautious shadow Ethan had observed days before. Now he was fully engaged, postured low and controlled, powerful shoulders rolling smoothly beneath his thick sable coat. At nearly 8 years old, Rex bore the marks of age and survival, scarred flanks, a faint stiffness in his right hind leg, but his mind was sharp, his discipline intact. His amber eyes read the forest like a living map, tracking scent and disturbance through layers of fresh snow that would have blinded any ordinary animal. He was not chasing blindly, he was hunting with purpose. The kidnappers had not stayed long at the cabin. Elias Korn was not a man who lingered once the objective changed. His lean, calculating natures favored movement over confrontation. He had taken Caleb deeper into the forest, using the storm to erase his trail, while Grant Holloway and Jonah Pike followed, struggling under the weight of their own panic. Grant's brute strength carried him forward, but his impatience left heavy marks in the snow. Jonah, thin and ill-prepared, stumbled often, fear slowing his already clumsy steps. Rex read those mistakes easily, adjusting course without hesitation. They reached a ravine where the land dropped sharply into a narrow, ice-choked channel. Wind screamed through the gap, carrying snow like smoke. Mara hesitated, peering down at the slick descent. That path leads toward the old mining route, she shouted over the gale. People used it years ago. It's unstable. Ethan assessed the terrain quickly. The ravine was dangerous, but it offered cover and a direct route. Exactly the kind of path Elias would choose. They went this way, he said, not as a guess, but a certainty. He looped a rope from his pack around a sturdy tree and anchored it with practiced speed. Stay close. Follow my steps. Mara nodded once. There was no hesitation in her eyes now, only resolve. As Ethan descended first, testing each foothold, Mara followed, muscles straining, hands numb from cold. Halfway down, ice shifted beneath her boot. She slipped, gasping, but Ethan caught her wrist instantly, his grip iron strong. I've got you, he said firmly. She steadied herself, swallowing fear, and continued. Above them, Rex took a separate route, scrambling down a steep embankment with controlled agility, rejoining them at the bottom without a sound. On the far side of the ravine, the forest opened into a clearing littered with the remains of old equipment, rusted barrels, collapsed wooden frames, the skeletal outline of a forgotten mining outpost. The storm muffled sound here, creating a hollow, oppressive silence. Ethan signaled for Mara to stop. He crouched low, scanning. Movement flickered near a derelict shack at the clearing's edge. Grant stood outside, massive arms folded, breath steaming, while Jonah paced nervously, rubbing his hands together. Inside, a dim lantern glow revealed Elias's silhouette, and Caleb, Mara's breath caught painfully. She started forward, but Ethan caught her arm gently, shaking his head. Wait, he whispered. We do this right. Her jaw clenched. tears freezing on her lashes. But she nodded. She trusted him now. Not because he was a soldier, but because he had not once treated her as helpless. Ethan studied the scene with cold clarity. Grant was the obvious threat. Strong, aggressive, but predictable. Jonah was unstable, likely to panic. Elias was the danger. He stood close to Caleb, his posture relaxed, one hand resting casually near the boy's shoulder, the other hidden beneath his coat where a weapon likely waited. Ethan exhaled slowly. Centering himself, he raised his hand slightly, fingers forming a subtle signal. Rex's response was immediate. The dog shifted position, circling wide through the storm. Using the wreckage for cover, snow clung to his fur, muting his outline. He moved not toward the men, but away from them, creating confusion in the scent pattern. Breaking expectations? Grant noticed first, squinting into the snow. "Did you hear that?" he muttered. Jonah's voice wavered. "I don't like this. We should leave." "Quiet," Elias snapped, his calm cracking just slightly. His eyes scanned the clearing, instincts finally whispering that something was wrong. That moment of distraction was all Ethan needed. He surged forward from cover, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Grant turned too late. Ethan struck with controlled force, a precise blow to the side of Grant's head that dropped the larger man into the snow with a stunned grunt. Jonah shouted, fumbling with his rifle. Then Rex was there. The German shepherd launched from the storm like a missile, jaws clamping onto Jonah's forearm with surgical precision. There was a crunch of bone, a scream cut short by pain and shock. Rex released instantly, stepping back into a guarded stance, teeth bared, eyes locked, ready but restrained. He did not pursue. He did not kill. He neutralized the threat exactly as he had been trained. Inside the shack, Elias reacted with chilling speed, yanking Caleb back, a pistol appearing in his hand. Mara screamed her son's name, her body lunging forward before Ethan caught her again. "Trust me," he said fiercely. Ethan stepped into view, hands raised slightly, his voice calm despite the adrenaline roaring through him. "It's over. Elias, you're outnumbered, and you're out of options." Elias laughed softly, pressing the gun against Caleb's shoulder. "You think this storm cares about options?" He said, "Drop the dog, step back, and maybe the kid walks away." Rex growled low, vibrating with restrained fury, but did not move. Ethan's eyes never left Elias's. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee, his posture non-threatening. At the same time, his left hand made the smallest of movements, two fingers closing inward. Rex understood. The dog moved in a blur, not toward Elias's throat, but upward, striking the gun arm with explosive force. Elias fired once, the shot wild, tearing into the shack's ceiling. Rex's jaws locked onto Elias's forearm, twisting, pulling him off balance. Ethan closed the remaining distance instantly, wrenching Caleb free and pulling him into Mara's arms. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, clutching her son against her chest as if afraid he might vanish again. Elias went down hard, screaming as Rex released and stepped back, standing over him, growling, teeth bared. But waiting, Ethan disarmed the man and secured him with practiced efficiency, his movements calm, controlled, devoid of excess violence. The storm howled around them, snow swirling through the open doorway. But the fight was over. Ethan knelt beside Mara and Caleb, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. Caleb looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, then turned to Rex. "He came back," the boy whispered. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Rex, who met his gaze steadily, tail low, posture proud. He did. As the wind began to ease, the blizzard's fury slowly giving way to exhausted silence, the three of them stood amid the wreckage of violence and survival. A soldier reclaimed his purpose. A mother held her child, and a war dog, once lost to the mountains, stood watch once more, not as a weapon, but as a guardian. Morning came quietly, as if the mountains themselves were exhausted from the violence of the night before. The storm that had ravaged Coldridge finally loosened its grip, retreating into the higher peaks and leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay smooth and unbroken beneath a pale blue sky, glittering faintly in the early light. The forest stood still, stripped of its fury, its trees heavy with frost and silence. For the first time in days, the air no longer screamed, it breathed. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the clearing near the abandoned mining outpost, his breath rising in slow, steady clouds, Fatigue weighed on his body, settling deep into muscles pushed far beyond exhaustion. But his posture remained straight, disciplined, unyielding. His broad frame was dusted with snow, dark beard stiff with ice, his weathered face drawn but calm. For years, his mornings had begun in hostile territory, with orders to follow and threats to neutralize. This morning was different. There was no mission clock, or no incoming fire, no need to move, only aftermath, only consequence. Behind him, the arrival of local law enforcement broke the silence. 2 snowmobiles cut through the drifts, engines whining softly as they approached. Sheriff Daniel Harper dismounted first, a man in his late 50s with a thick gray beard and a solid, barrel-chested build that spoke of decades spent working harsh land rather than behind a desk. His lined face carried the kind of calm authority earned through experience, and his eyes, tired but sharp, took in the scene with quiet understanding. He was followed by Deputy Aaron Miles, a younger man in his late 20s, tall and lanky, his clean-shaven face pale with cold and adrenaline. Aaron's movements were efficient but tense, his gaze flicking between the bound criminals and Ethan with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Sheriff Harper surveyed the subdued men, now secured and shivering, their bravado stripped away by daylight. "Looks like you did our job for us," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Just held things together," he replied. "You finished it?" Harper studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Were you Navy?" "Yes, sir." "Figured," Harper said. "Only military moves like that in weather sane folks hide from." There was no accusation in his tone. He only respect. Nearby, Mara Whitaker sat wrapped in a thick thermal blanket. Her tall, slender frame curled protectively around Caleb. Her dark hair, once wild from the storm, was now braided neatly down her back. Frost melted into damp strands. Her face remained pale, skin chapped and bruised by cold. But her green eyes were alive again, focused, present. She kept one arm locked tightly around her son, the other resting on Rex's broad back. Caleb leaned into her, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. His small hand was buried deep in Rex's thick fur, fingers clutching instinctively as if the dog were an anchor to reality. Rex sat beside them, calm and immovable, his powerful body forming a living barrier between mother, child, and the world beyond. His scars were clearly visible now in daylight, etched across his shoulders and flank, his muzzle beginning to gray with age. At 8 years old, Rex was no longer young, but his amber eyes were clear, alert, and deeply intelligent. He watched the deputies with steady focus, not as threats, but as variables. Mara looked up as Ethan approached. Their eyes met, and in that moment, there was no need for words. Gratitude, trust, and shared survival passed silently between them. "You didn't leave," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I couldn't." Later that day, as the criminals were transported down the mountain and the clearing emptied, Coldridge began to stir. News traveled quickly in a town this small. By afternoon, trucks arrived with supplies, neighbors checking in, offering help without questions. There were hot meals delivered in mismatched containers, spare firewood stacked neatly against cabins, blankets and coats left quietly on porches. The Whitakers were no longer alone. Neither was Ethan. In the days that followed, the story settled into something more than rumor. People spoke of the soldier who walked into the storm instead of away from it, of the war dog thought lost to the mountains who returned when he was needed most. Rex became a familiar sight in town, moving calmly at Ethan's side, children watching him with wide-eyed fascination, adults offering respectful distance. He did not seek attention. He did not need it. His presence alone was enough. Sheriff Harper visited Ethan one evening as the sun dipped low behind the peaks. Inside the cabin, firelight cast long shadows on the walls. Rex lay near the hearth, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. "I won't sugarcoat it," Harper said, settling into a chair. "We don't have the resources we should. Search and rescue here is volunteer-based. No formal K-9 unit. After what I saw, that needs to change." Ethan listened quietly. "I want you to stay," Harper continued. "Train a dog unit, search and rescue, tracking, emergency response. You'd have authority, support, and a purpose that doesn't involve burying friends overseas." Ethan stared into the fire for a long moment. The offer settled heavily in his chest. For the first time in years, the path forward did not feel like an escape or a retreat. It felt like a choice. "I'm not done serving," he said finally. But I'm done fighting wars that only take. Harper smiled faintly. Good. This place needs men who give back. Spring came slowly to Coldridge. Snow receded from the lower trails, revealing dark earth and stubborn green shoots pushing through frozen ground. Training began behind the sheriff's office, a modest field marked by cones and makeshift obstacles. Deputy Aaron Miles was the first to volunteer, his nervous energy tempered by discipline as Ethan guided him through drills. Rex observed from the sidelines, no longer a frontline operator, but a seasoned mentor. His movements were slower now, but his authority was unquestioned. Mara watched from a nearby bench, a book resting forgotten in her lap. She had returned to her routines, repairing fences, tending supplies, rebuilding not just her cabin but her sense of safety. She stood tall again, her confidence restored not by false assurances, but by proof that protection could exist without taking freedom. Caleb sat nearby, drawing in a battered sketchbook, his world once again filled with imagination rather than fear. One afternoon, Ethan noticed the picture Caleb was working on. It showed a man, broad and strong, a woman standing beside him, a small boy holding hands with both, and a large dog seated proudly at their feet. Behind them rose the mountains, no longer threatening, but watchful. Ethan swallowed hard, as summer light stretched long into the evenings. Ethan found that the ghosts he had carried for so long no longer shouted in the silence. Rex slept soundly now, untroubled by unseen threats. Mara laughed more easily. Caleb ran freely through the woods, never alone, always watched. And Ethan, once a man lost in white emptiness, had found something solid beneath his feet. He had come to Alaska to disappear. Instead, he stayed to build something that would last. A unit, a family, a future. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in gold and fire, Ethan Cole stood beside his war dog, knowing with quiet certainty that the storm had not broken him. It had led him home, sometimes. Miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, on four paws, and in a moment of courage, or through the hands of someone who refuses to walk away when the storm is at its worst. This story reminds us that even when life feels frozen, when loss and fear surround us like an endless winter, we are never truly alone. Strength can return when we least expect it. Hope can rise from places we believed were buried forever. And the bonds formed through love, a loyalty, and sacrifice are never truly broken, no matter how much time or darkness stands between us. In our daily lives, we may not face blizzards or life and death battles, but we all face storms of our own. Moments when we feel lost, exhausted, or forgotten. Let this story be a reminder that protection often comes in unexpected forms, and that faith, perseverance, and kindness still matter more than ever. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may be walking through a storm right now. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, or share your own story of a moment when help arrived just when you needed it most. And if you believe that stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that bring light, hope, and meaning to others, and may God bless you and your loved ones. May He guide your steps through every storm, protect you in moments of fear, and remind you that you are never abandoned, even when the path feels dark. Thank you for watching,